I will share my screen. Yeah, thank you. So I will just share my screen just so that we can. Just a second. All right, there we go. It should be. All right. So as I've already been introduced, I'm Kenneth Rama. And the session is on disaster risk reduction for marginalized and vulnerable communities. And I might talk about all this in just a sec. And just to begin by saying that I have worked in development sector for about 5 years now. I have been in programs that are aligned towards climate adaptation and mitigation. And in 2019, I got more footing into disaster risk reduction, so supporting resilience building projects and activities in Ethiopia. And last year, that even increased in scope. Of course, with the virtual work, I was able to cover Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia Pacific. So it would be interesting to also see that there is participants from those regions so that we can share various experiences of disasters and vulnerabilities. And we are doing all this, we're looking at inclusion in a bigger picture, so how inclusion can also be embedded in disaster risk reduction for marginalized communities. I have just completed a master's in crisis and disaster management at University of Portsmouth in the UK. So I am in the UK, but I'm Kenyan. So this topic is actually quite important for me as a practitioner in community development, because I have worked in communities, I've engaged and interacted with communities, sat under trees and understood the issues that they experience. And most of those that align with disaster management and disaster risk reduction, there are critical elements of inclusion or lack of inclusion that come about, and issues to do with discrimination as well. So it was interesting to have a conference, a global conference like this, where we can all sit, or meet virtually like this, and discuss some of those dimensions and how inclusion can be embedded in disaster risk reduction for our communities. So we will begin with a bit of an activity just to get us going. So where you're joining us from, we'd want to know where you're joining us from and which disasters you've ever experienced in your communities. So in your communities, just what you think could have been a disaster or may have been a disaster. We want you to help us, just share with us. And my colleague John will help in this bit. So John.
Yeah, I will, but please just take your screen down, Kenneth.
Yeah, of course.
I can share mine. So please just go to that link directly. You can click on it, that's in the chat, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code that you can see there. 462844 is the code. So just a moment. We've got one person in Kigali, Rwanda. Let's see where other people are. Glasgow, Scotland. Okay. Kenya, Portsmouth, UK, Taiwan. Glasgow, over here, Glasgow, Swansea in Wales. I would be adding Mombasa in Kenya if I was doing it, but I'm just concentrating on the screen. Okay. If you're not able to access it, you could just put your answers in the chat. Okay. All right, let's go to the next question then. Well, we had one more coming up then. I think that was probably Kenya again, was it? Let's just go back to that. Georgia. Okay, great. Good to have somebody from Georgia with us, our hosts. So the question is, what disasters have you ever experienced in your community? I think the system allows you to answer up to 3 times. So maybe you've experienced different types of disasters. Let's see what people say. What disasters have you ever experienced in your community? Tornado, flooding, mudslides, typhoon, El Nino, earthquake, famine, heat waves, storms, drought, terror attack, floods or flooding has come up several times. So has drought and famine. If the way this works, if they're bigger, it means more than one person has put them. Any more? Anybody would like to add any in the chat if you're not able to access the Menti? Okay, so that just gives us some idea of the kind of disasters people have experienced. Floods and famine in the chat. Heavy rain, storms, I think I said. Earthquake is a new one there. Okay. All right, thank you. So I'll hand back to Ken, but that just gives us some ideas of the kind of disasters people have experienced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So we can all see that from our communities or wherever we come from, we have experienced disasters in certain ways, or a disaster also. I'm just sharing my screen again. Lovely. So we can see that even in our communities, we've experienced various forms of disasters, and that's I think it's the reason why we're also here. We want to see how we can all adopt better strategies to address disasters. So what I will do is I will give you just a brief overview of disaster concepts, so that if this is a new term or this is a new field, then at least you can be able to have that basic information of what disaster is and related concepts. So a disaster is an occurrence that affects people's livelihoods. So it can either cause loss of life, damage to property, extensive and significant damage or impact in your communities, to an extent where the community is not able to cope with the damage. So they are not able to address the issues or to address the impacts on their own. There is need for external support. That is what a disaster is. If it happens and a community is still able to contain it, is still able to manage it, then it becomes a hazard. So a hazard is just a potential occurrence that also has this, widespread, has the ability to cause widespread impact. And we're looking at impacts, these social impacts, economic impacts, environmental impact, and so much more. For risk is that likelihood of an occurrence. So the likelihood of loss of life, the likelihood of damage to your house, or damage to your property, or flooding happening in your area. That is the risk that is associated with it. And then exposure is in terms of that living arrangement. What is the situation on the ground in terms of, are you exposed? Are you living in a place that is, on a flood plain? So for example, if you live in an area that has tectonic activities, then earthquakes might happen, so you're always exposed. And vulnerability are those characteristics that makes you susceptible, or they make you more vulnerable than the other. And I'll give an example of, if there is flooding, what would make one household to be impacted more than the other household? Those are the characteristics that we'd look at. Or why is it that flooding in, say, in Nepal would be more detrimental and have greater impact than flooding, say, in Netherlands? So those are the kind of vulnerabilities that we're talking about. And we'll go into details later, so do not worry about those concepts. Sometimes when you're new to them, they might throw you off a bit. But what you need to get from this is the model, which is the diagram on the right, is that for you to experience disaster risk, or for there to be disaster risks, there also need to be hazards, which are those potential loss of lives and damage to property, those occurrences that have the potential to cause damage to property, or loss of lives and livelihoods. And then there's also vulnerability, which is that susceptibility, exposure and risk, vulnerability put together. They all lead to, or they all have an implication when you're looking at disaster risk. And that is just the model that I would want you to have at the back of your heads, or at the back of your minds, that there is hazards, there is vulnerabilities, and then there's that exposure, and that is what brings about a disaster risk. So then we keep talking about disaster risk reduction and what that is. Again, just to break it down in a much more understandable way, there is different phases of a disaster. There is the preparedness phase, where communities get ready. They put in place measures. They start building like sea defenses in case of sea flooding or coastal flooding. They start moving to maybe different zones, which are less susceptible. If it is those living in say areas that are prone to earthquakes, then they build houses that are more resilient, houses that are able to withstand. So that is preparedness. Mitigation is more to do with processes of policies, so many long-term changes in terms of how they are able to cope in future. So putting in place measures for long-term changes. So it could be passing policies that no one should live within 30 meters of a river that is normally prone to flooding, or it could be you cannot live along the fault lines, or in the case of tsunamis, for example, you can also not build using certain materials because of their detrimental impacts. And then response is the the moment, or all the activities put together at the moment where a disaster happens and immediately after it happens. So it involves things to do with search and rescue, provision of first aid and emergency medical response. It also includes distribution of aid. So you would see organizations, governments, and NGOs distributing food aid, like in the situation in Ukraine, there's the Red Cross and many other organizations distributing relief and organizing transport, the humanitarian corridors and all that. So that is response. Recovery is after the disaster has happened and the communities are trying or are now putting in place activities, or they're implementing activities to build back better. So they're rebuilding the houses, they're opening or reopening the schools and hospitals. They're starting to farm, they're recovering to restore their lost livelihoods. So in general, disaster risk reduction therefore involves all the activities that are taken or that are undertaken to prepare for, mitigate, respond to, and even recover from disasters. So then we're talking about inclusion or social inclusion for disaster risk reduction, and looking at the disaster management cycle. I've already mentioned about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So at the back of your mind also as we proceed, you need to start reflecting then that how can inclusion be embedded in mitigation, in response, in preparedness, and even in recovery during a disaster or in the phases of a disaster. And we'll come back to this in a later slide. So just have it in the back of your mind, just reflecting as well. So just to take you briefly through a few disaster trends, looking at the year of 2019, and 2019 is quite the choice because it was before COVID. So I know with COVID, then the data would have been different because also COVID is a disaster on its own. It's a biological disaster. And so looking at 2019, you can see that the number of disasters across 10 countries, top 10 countries, you can actually see that there's Asia as well, there's Africa, there's Europe, and the Americas in red. So that means they have the highest number of disaster occurrences, or they had the highest number of disaster occurrences in 2019 alone. But you can also see countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, even the United States and France. If you look at also that 2019, the averages of 2009 to 2018. So you look at the averages compared to what 2019 alone had, you can see that there is general increase in disaster occurrences. If you look at flooding, which is in blue and much bigger, it's 194 compared to an average of across about 10 years, an average of 149. So disaster, I know like flooding has been mentioned by the participants. You mentioned it during the introduction bit, like flooding and floods, and just lots of rain and too much water to deal with. So these affect communities. You can also see things like earthquakes have also increased, especially the disasters that are more inclined or are much more affiliated with climate change. In terms of the number of deaths as well, you can see that the average for the last of so an average of 10 years compared to 2019, there is also quite a significance. So floods have also increased, and we've seen that from the previous slides in terms of the number of occurrences. So it just gives you that impression of the trends that disasters are taking in the current age. And just to look at that trend in general, then you'd see that disasters are not reducing over the years. So in the last 10 years, 20 years, disasters are not increasing, rather they are increasing. And this is important because as people working in community development, we need to be aware that these disaster trends are changing, or disaster trends are on an upward trend. And so the work or the activities that we do, the projects that we implement, be it education, be it health, be it livelihood related, will also be impacted by disaster occurrences. Because if you're running a learning institution or you're running an education program, children will not be able to go to school if their classes are torn apart by earthquakes or are shattered by cyclones. So then vulnerability. So this is where most of our activities will revolve around, or most of our discussion will revolve around. And like I mentioned, vulnerabilities that they're the characteristics or the conditions that will increase susceptibility to a disaster or to a hazard. So a hazard is before it overwhelms the community and before it has that detrimental impact, whereas a disaster is when it has already happened and it's already having a massive impact on lives and even property, just to remind us of the differences. But it can also be used interchangeably. So human vulnerabilities are these characteristics that will make one person or one household more vulnerable than the other in the face of a disaster. So an issue, so for example, information. So if you do not have information about disasters, if there was an earthquake that was that has been predicted to happen maybe in a few days or in a few hours, if you do not have that information, then you become more vulnerable than someone who has the information and knows what to do with it. Things to do with age, someone who is younger, for example, would have less vulnerability when dealing with things like sudden onset disasters, like terror attacks. I think someone mentioned terror attacks. If you're of old age, then you're much more vulnerable to disasters. In the UK, where I am now, we just came from summer with extensive heat waves. And in the UK alone, during summertime, heat waves actually kill people. They take lives, and even up to 3,000 people could die annually because of heat waves or heat wave related deaths. And that also can be a factor of age because most of them are normally the elderly. So things to do with skills. What skills do you have? Do you have a disability or do you not have a disability? So these are the human factors or human characteristics that may make you either vulnerable or not vulnerable. Issues to do with family size. A family that has 2 people and a family that has 10 people, they might experience different levels of vulnerabilities. In terms of social characteristics, it could be, social is how we relate from one person to the other. So is there any support groups? Is there any networks that you're part of that will help you overcome disasters or recover from them, or even take in less impact as opposed to the others? Things to do with religion. I remember when I was doing some risk assessments, a community mentioned that when they're faced with drought, all they do is to pray, or one of the things they do is to pray, because in their social constructs of their society, religion is quite a significant thing in overcoming troubles and tribulations. So having that religious standpoint and religious side of disaster management, if I would say, is also quite important for some communities. In Nairobi, where I also come from, whenever there is fire in one of the slums, which is Kibera slums, what happens is once your house is burnt down, then there is more like a mechanism where your neighbors would help you fundraise and rebuild your house as soon as possible. So those are some of the social things that will either make someone vulnerable or not vulnerable. In terms of economic, so these are to do with income, the levels of income for of your household or of yourself or of your community. So if you have a job, you probably have some income, then you have the money to, say, move, to relocate to higher grounds in the event of flooding or potential flooding, or you're able to rebuild your house. So if your house has been burnt down or has been torn apart by earthquakes, you're able to rebuild your house because you already have you have that capacity of finance. And talking of finance, things to do with savings as well, things to do with insurance. So in 2010 in Haiti and also 2015 in Nepal, there was massive earthquakes. And one of the issues that came about was that in the recovery phase, communities could not rebuild houses because they didn't have insurance. Whereas those who are well off, those who are of high economic status, they were able to rebuild the houses sooner because they had insurance services or access to insurance. And physical and infrastructural is just dealing with amenities, so roads, railway lines, transport systems in general, water, like drainage. If the drainage is poor, then there is likelihood of flooding. Things to do with location of critical infrastructure or amenities. So what is the distance to the nearest hospital? What is the distance to school? If children have to walk 10 miles to school or 5 miles to school, how does that impact on their overall resilience? And finally, environmental, this is to do with water. Is there access to clean water for that community? Where is that located as well? What is the rock or soil composition, things like that, because those also have an impact on landslides or even earthquake events where loose soil would have far more reaching consequences. Things to do with vegetation, the climate, the weather, those are environmental factors because they also have that impact. And the example is in the tropical region of Sub-Saharan Africa, there is even other diseases like dengue fever, and these are also classified as disasters when they overwhelm communities. So it's quite interesting to look at various dimensions of vulnerability. So I won't go further into that. I will just give you an example of a hurricane that happened. So, and if you look at Hurricane Maria, which happened in Dominica in 2017, it was a hurricane, category 5, which is the highest category in terms of hurricane classification. You could see from the screen that there was impact on water, shelter, power, bridges, and so those are in infrastructural or physical, and water is environmental. Emergency services, so in terms of access to and the nearest emergency medical services, impact on food, and impact on livestock as well. So I'd want us to even go deeper and have a conversation around vulnerabilities to various disasters in your communities. And we'd like to do this in groups. So my colleague will help put us into groups where we'll have about 20 minutes. We'll monitor the time and see how that fluctuates as well, or if there's need to fluctuate it. But in your groups, you will be asked or you are expected to discuss vulnerabilities to disasters that you've experienced in your community. So you can either choose to agree on one disaster. It could be flooding, it could be earthquakes, it could be, someone mentioned terrorist attacks. So what would make communities vulnerable to those hazards or to those disasters? And also within that conversation, talk about some of the factors that you think lead to these vulnerabilities. So the deeply rooted factors that could promote these vulnerabilities. So when you're talking about, there isn't enough, so there isn't adequate water supply or supply of fresh water, piped water in your community, what could be the underlying causes of such vulnerabilities? And then also finally, just look at how inclusion can influence disaster resilience. Can it even influence in the first place? Or in your groups, ask yourself, is it possible to have inclusion influence disaster resilience, looking at the vulnerabilities that you will have discussed, and how can that be achieved? How can that be made possible? So you'll have about 20 minutes. Please appoint one person in your groups, or one person can volunteer in your groups to just record the notes in a Google Docs link that will also be provided for you in the chat. so you can access it. John or Meredith, the groups would be going, yeah?
Yeah, so if everybody's ready, I'm gonna just open up the breakout rooms. If you want to copy the link from the Google Doc, just first, just to make sure that you've got that and the questions. And if everybody's ready, then I'm just gonna open up the breakout rooms and you'll have 20 minutes to do this. Hey, Holly, if you're having any trouble getting back into your room, just let me know. All right, that's everybody back now. Thanks, everyone.
All right. I hope you had indulging conversations. I know Nancy, you're cut short as you're just saying something on our side. So yeah, anyways, I think we can just hear what you had discussed, what discussions you had going on, and then we can wrap it up and conclude and have a way forward regarding inclusion in disaster risk reduction. So group one, do you want to go first? That should, I think, be the group you are in, John and David, I think. Any of you want to share with us?
David, go ahead. You did most of the notes, so I think you should go ahead.
First of all, I was in the best group with the best minds. So you guys prepare. So we looked at, first of all, the vulnerabilities, and we were looking at our locality. The area we are looking at is Kenya. And the two main disasters that we looked at is the drought and flooding. We have, like currently Kenya is going through one of its worst droughts. These areas, Kenya is composed of 47 counties, and out of all these, we have 20 that are really experiencing the drought. So those are the two main vulnerabilities that the disasters we are experiencing. We are experiencing and have experienced for a while. And the second, when we're looking at the factors that promote, that cause these vulnerabilities, among what we mentioned is the poor infrastructure. And Mr. John gave an example, we're looking at a country like Rwanda, where there is a proper road and there's a proper drainage. So when it's an opposite of that, we find in our areas where we have areas where there's poor infrastructure, and even the drainage system is so bad. So even when it rains, when it pours, there's so much clogging, and things become, especially in Nairobi, in the capital. But when we go outside, we also see areas. There's a common area. There's an area in the Rift Valley area, in the western part of Kenya, that we have really experienced bad floods, which has happened like always when we have long rains. So, and these, we were looking at negligence, and we were saying about there's a negligence where, especially from the citizens, where maybe we do so much afforestation, and the environmental management is very bad. And also for the authorities, when they want to bring development, they will not pay attention so much to the implications of what will come thereafter. And I was with both of my team. There was this quote that was saying, "You can't stand in the way of development when maybe government wants to bring in." So even if there are institutions that will speak and say that this is not right at the moment, but still it continues, then the implications come later on. And also we're talking about the afforestation. There was a period that we are cutting so much trees, and it's only at this time when we are recovering from this and greening. We are like now greening Kenya, and so those are the key things that we mentioned. The other thing is about how inclusion influenced disaster, and it was so straight that participation, especially through the bottom-up approach, whereby we start with the people who live in the communities, whether in the urban or in the semi-urban and in the rural, that we include the authorities and the grant makers to make sure that there's participation, and it is through the bottom-up approach, because this will lead to ownership, where people will feel like they have a mandate to take care of the environment and to report in case of any disasters that appear. Yeah, so those are the main some of the things we mentioned. Maybe if Mr. John and Dr. Daniel, if there's something I'm forgetting, you can mention.
No, I
Thank
think
you,
that's
David.
pretty thorough. Thank you, David. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, do you want to, anyone wants to add anything on that? Those who are within the same group, or has he done a tremendous job?
He's done it.
Thank you so much, David. On so group 2, do you also want to share as well?
Dr. Mary, will you be sharing?
Okay. Allow me to see if I can get the things which were done or we discussed. Okay. We looked at the vulnerabilities that cause disaster in the various regions which we talked about, and somehow most of us were coming from Kenya, and we shared our experiences of the region, and in particular Kenya. And we realized that the kind of circumstances we find ourselves in as a people make us vulnerable to disaster. Things like, for example, the kind of housing that people have. When floods come, they are easily swept away. People are suffering from lack of information. They do not understand even the weather forecast. So when floods come, it is just like pop. Nobody knew anything about the heavy rains coming because there wasn't any warning. Being a regular thing, for example, the floods and the famine, what have we learned over the past many years? Why should it be a disaster every year, year in, year out? We need to learn from experiences so that we can stop having the same disaster over and over again. We talked of looking for ways or strategies of managing such disasters. Like today, it is heavily raining. We are crying of disaster. 2 weeks down the line, we are crying of shortage of water. Why can't we manage it so that when rain and plenty of water is available, we can harvest to be used during the dry seasons? We talked of things like destruction of the ecosystem being a really cause of disasters, especially famine and floods in our region. Poverty. A poor person does not mind whether flood is coming or not. If we could deal with the poverty, we could have managed many other problems. There's something we call the dependence syndrome. We are always waiting, seated to see external players to come in and help. If we can be able to build the capacity of our people so that they can take the front in dealing with their own vulnerabilities, the better than when we are depending on external sources. Poor environmental management was one of the things which came out. Lack of exposure, lack of education, and the systems or infrastructural development brought all those things in terms of poor drainage, poor planning, and etc. We talked of mindset change. We can bring all the development to avert disasters, but people must be targeted first so that they can develop a way of understanding things differently and managing their own problems in a way that is sustainable and lasting to their communities. And therefore, we need to look at the cultures of the people and think, how can we influence them culturally to be at the top of it? We talked of lack of government intervention, especially when the disasters are huge and they cannot be intervened from the community level. The government need to have proper planning, foresight, so that they can come on board and arrest the situation. Indigenous perspectives need to be taken into consideration. What have people been doing before? There used to be rain those years, the yesteryears, and our communities never died as they do. There used to be droughts, but our people never died of famine the way they do. What is the treasure in communities that we can tap and use those indigenous knowledge and skills to avert the disasters that we face today? I think in summary, those were our views.
Lovely.
you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary, for sharing those contributions. So we can all already have a feeling and get a grasp of the connection between inclusion and disaster management. Whereas disaster management is a very extensive area, we can focus on the vulnerabilities because it is the vulnerabilities that make communities and households or individuals feel the impact or feel varying impacts of disasters. So if we strengthen vulnerabilities, so that means we change vulnerabilities into capacities. So we, on the flip side of it, so when you're vulnerable, you are not able to cope, and you get greatly or tremendously affected by a disaster, that is where most communities are, and that's why disaster impacts are increasing. But what if, using inclusive approaches, we can turn these vulnerabilities into capacity, so that instead of, say, having a weak house, having not having enough moral support, then you're able to get enough support from your communities. You're able to access without difficulties, like even opportunities or products that will help you and your household overcome disasters. So I just want us to finish by looking at the model once more. So if you look at your screen, you have talked about various aspects of disaster vulnerabilities and what can be. Sorry, I think that's just unmute. So we've talked about various aspects of disaster vulnerabilities, and these all fall in place within the different phases of disaster management. In terms of what can be done to promote inclusion, all of that needs to fit somewhere within the disaster management cycle. So if you look at mitigation, what needs to be done to ensure that as we plan ahead, as we look at long-term resilience of disasters, then we're also including communities. No one is feeling discriminated in the process. So the policies that are being passed, by various decision makers, how inclusive are the policies? Is it a policy saying girls cannot go to school, whereas we're looking at long-term resilience? And we've seen that lack of education, lack of knowledge and skills is one of the vulnerabilities. So if you leave out a certain segment of the community, be it the elderly people, be it the persons with disabilities, if they feel left out of that process, then we are not achieving disaster resilience. Look at preparedness as well. As communities are trying to put in place measures for an imminent disaster, is everyone part of the process? Are they actively involved to an extent that they also own it? One of the groups mentioned about that feeling of ownership of the interventions that are put across. And once a disaster happens, how is the response? How inclusive is the response? We remember quite well during COVID. Well, I don't know whether COVID is done, but last year there was the issues of vaccine access. So where some countries or some regions were feeling like they are being denied that access to vaccines, or vaccines are made available, but at an extra cost that even the poorest and the most marginalized communities cannot access. When you talk about vaccination, and you have to pay for the vaccine, or to get a test just to check whether you have COVID or not, that is a problem. So how we respond to disasters also matters a lot in terms of inclusion. And then even in the recovery phase, how we are building back better, how we are making our communities even stronger, so that in the event of future disasters, there's less impact, or even no impact at all, because that is ideally the world that we'd want. So in summary, I'd want us to look at some of the ways that we can promote inclusion in disaster risk reduction. And one of them has already been mentioned, actually, of having a community-based approach, or a community-centered approach to your programs as community development practitioners. Are you using community-centered approaches? Someone mentioned bottoms up, but that's also just a bigger picture of community-centered approaches, where the communities are involved in the processes from the start to the finish, and even in oversight and all of that. That makes communities feel much more embedded in all the initiatives that address their needs in terms of disaster. You've probably heard of a slogan of leave no one behind. So as community development practitioners, are we leaving someone behind? Are we discriminating against other people? Are we leaving women behind? Are we leaving children behind? Are we leaving those in rural areas behind? And people who have higher literacy levels and lower literacy levels, how included are they in the process? And lastly, you've probably also heard of the do no harm principle. So we use this a lot in disaster management work, and especially humanitarian response, when organizations and institutions are addressing the needs of marginalized communities affected by various disasters. The interventions that we put across, the activities that we're implementing, are they also making sure that there is no further harm that is caused to those marginalized communities? If you're implementing a project of digging wells or digging boreholes for communities, in the process of implementing those, are you making sure that you are not exposing people to further harm? You're not polluting the environment further. You are not discriminating certain set of people in that demographic and all that. So that's just a summary of what it means to be inclusive in disaster risk reduction. And so just to finish, I'll have a list of further reading that we've recommended. I think John would be able to provide the direct links as well for you in the chat. But also feel free to reach out to network. You can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Kenneth Rama, and also you can drop me an email for any collaborations, just to say hi. It's a community, your community development practitioner. So feel free to reach out for anything, or to stay in touch, or to share any of the resources that you might have as well. And that is the end of my presentation from my end. I don't know how we're doing with time. We're about 4 minutes over, so I hope that's not too bad as well. But I hope you also enjoyed the session, and you have a clearer perspective when you're dealing with your community development work, whether it's around disaster risk reduction or any other thing. You've noticed that disaster risk reduction is blanket, it's a blanket approach that covers health, education, be it any other livelihoods, policy processes, so all of that, and how you need to be inclusive in those processes. So thank you very much. I think I will hand over back to Meredith, maybe. Meredith, for any questions, any last indulgences. Thank you.
Yes, so we'll just wrap it up here. If anybody has any questions about the remainder of the conference, any sessions that you're going to, anything you're unclear about, I'll put my email in the chat just now. And we'll leave this session open for another couple of minutes so that people can just take this down.
Maybe if we've got a couple of minutes, we could just do a quick round and get any reflections or comments about the session. What do you think?
Yeah,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
It may not be necessarily a question, but probably it is something for us to think through together. And I'll use Kenya as an example. Over and time again, there are disasters that have afflicted our country and our people. Some communities are actually known for specific disasters. Like, for example, when you go to Budalangi, I am sure that some of you might know the place, we'll be talking of floods. When we go to northeastern Kenya, always we'll be talking of drought and famine. I appreciate the efforts that are being put in place by whichever players, government and non-governmental alike, to avert the situation and address the issues at hand in terms of response, which is immediate or rehabilitative. But I'm just wondering, and maybe that's where my issue comes in, what is a sustainable way of helping these communities? Either for the communities to help themselves, or if external players have to come in, what can be done so that we don't see them go there every year for the last 30 years, doing the same thing over and over again, and the problem is still real? Is there a sustainable disaster management possibility? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very powerful question. And in Kenya, now that it's contextual to Kenya, in Kenya, it's the Red Cross that is mandated by the government to lead all disaster response and humanitarian response in the country. So they're the lead agency, if I may say. And I'm mentioning them because initially, the approach that was being used was more responsive or more reactive rather than proactive. So whenever floods happened, they were quick on the ground to provide relief aid, and once that is done, then they're almost non-existent in that community, and so forth and so on. But recently, organizations and players have started adopting a more long-term approach to disaster management and even humanitarian response. Even the organizations themselves have now embedded development, humanitarian work, and peace nexus across their programming. So if you look at many organizations now, they have long-term programming in those communities. And I think that is the best way to go, because it only makes sense to have a holistic and and long-term based approach rather than just instantaneous of in and out, and then the cycle goes on, and every year there's that need. Of course, it doesn't eliminate the need to provide like immediate assistance, but in the background, there's also that long-term programming that goes on. And I've seen many organizations are already looking at humanitarian development and peace nexus as a whole. And peace comes in because some of the conflicts are, some of the disasters are human conflict or human induced, such as like war, like the situation happening in Ukraine at the moment. So having that aspect of peace also in the long-term programming is important. It might not be conclusive response to your question, but like you said, is also something to think about. And I'm happy to have anyone else also chip in with that regard. Any other thing? I was sharing, during the planning phase of this session, we were sharing with a few of my colleagues here that it's always interesting to see how even the gender aspect comes about in disaster management. And an example is the hurricanes. One of the students in my university here did a research on gender dimensions in disaster management, especially in the Caribbean, and it was quite interesting to note that hurricanes that have female names, people didn't take them seriously, whereas hurricanes with male names, people took them seriously. So like Hurricane Ian or cyclone, a cyclone with a male name, people took it seriously and actually putting in place measures to counter it and to be ready for it. Whereas those that had female names like Hurricane Maria, for example, which had detrimental impact in Dominica, like people didn't really take it seriously. And there's just that research to show that people's perception towards gender also is deeply embedded in the way they respond to disaster events. So it's quite interesting to note, right? Yeah. Great. I think, Meredith, if there isn't any other contributions or questions, I'm happy for us to end it. And yeah, just end it on a good note as well.
Perfect. I'm going to stop the recording now.